Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you this evening. Had a slight moment of panic when Matthias asked us to greet the people around us. I always panic in a gathering of Americans that somebody's going to try to hug me, but I was glad that the scowl that I immediately sported at that point discouraged anybody from reckless behavior. It is a great pleasure to be on the campus of Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. I've never actually been here before. I've been resident in the States now for some 23 years, but have never stood on the campus, and yet many of the people associated with Gordon-Conwell have had tremendous impact on me. My former Westminster colleague, Greg Beale, taught me a huge amount about how to interpret Scripture. Like many people of my generation, I think David Wells's book, No Place for Truth, had a seismic impact on the way that I thought about the church. Don Fairbairn taught me to appreciate patristics and aspects of Eastern Orthodoxy. And T. David Gordon, old colleague from Grove, tremendous fun, I would say, as a person. And I mustn't forget that we were talking earlier on, Professor Vidu and I. The last time I saw Professor Vidu was in Romania, the week before Christmas in 1998, when he acted as my translator on a trip to Romania. I don't know if you heard me preach on the Sunday morning, if you remember what happened on the Sunday morning. I arrived in Romania late on the Saturday night and was driven from Budapest to across the border by some crazy Romanian in a car held together by elastic bands. We got to the house of Emil Bartos, who was one of the pastors. And I sat having dinner. This is 11 o'clock at night, having just flown in from London. And Emil said to me, "What are you preaching on tomorrow morning?" And I said, "I'm not preaching. I've just come to teach Reformation." And I realized at that point that the only leadership model that Romanian pastors had was the kind of Stalinist strongman, really. That's what they'd grown up with. Emil said, "You are preaching tomorrow morning. What are you preaching on?" So I blurted out 1 Corinthians. And I think I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I never preached before. I knocked together this terrible sermon on 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I stood up and preached. And it was Cornelius Simut, I think, who translated for me. And I sat down, and a hymn was sung by the congregation, and then Emil stood up and preached. And I thought, well, this is hardcore, that we have two sermons on a Sunday morning. As Emil came and sat down next to me after he preached, I said to him, "Wow, that's hardcore. You have two sermons on a Sunday morning?" He said, "No." He said, "You are absolutely rubbish." He said, "I couldn't possibly have let my people go away with so little on a Sunday morning." I made the mistake of telling that story to a colleague at Westminster who used to use me as an illustration, apparently, in his preaching class. But it is a pleasure to be with you this evening. I've been given, I'm going to give two lectures at this conference. The first lecture is going to be sort of a narrative lecture, when I want to address the shape of modernity in the modern person relative to a sort of broadly historical narrative going back to the Reformation. And in the second lecture, I want to take a more sort of synthetic approach and come in at the beginning of the second lecture and say, you know, if we can boil down what is going wrong at the moment, let's look at these three particular heads. And then at the end of that lecture, reflect on what are the three things or the three areas where the church can think about addressing these issues. I think one of the great temptations today is to be overwhelmed at the speed of the way things are changing. If we can identify a few key categories, then we can focus on using the resources that I think we already have in order to better address those three categories where things are going so terribly wrong, not only in our culture, but in the wider church world as well. I'm going to shy away from using the language of evangelical and evangelicalism for some of the reasons, actually, Matthias has already hinted at. I struggle with, in America, is it a political term or a sociological term or a theological term? And it seems to me that it has such a bad rap at the moment. I want to think really in terms of, I often say to people, I'm a Christian first, a Protestant second, and a Presbyterian third, in descending order of importance. And I really want to talk in these lectures, I would say, about Protestantism. Confessional, conservative Protestantism. Protestantism that believes the Bible. Protestantism that believes the creeds. Protestantism that is supernatural. There were two other things that happened in 1923 that I think are significant for us today. One of them is that the Institute for Social Research was founded at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and critical theory started to become a thing 100 years ago. More of a thing now, I think, than it was 100 years ago. And the other thing, of course, was that J. Gresham Machen published his, I think, an amazing piece of theological journalism, Christianity and Liberalism, where he really crystallized the issue there as one, not between different Christian denominations, but between those who had a supernatural faith and those who denied the supernatural. So I really want to talk in these two lectures to supernaturalist Christians. Okay. I was also struck listening to the headlines from 1923. As I was on flight this afternoon, I'm teaching a course. The title is A Shameless Hook. The title is Shadows of the Antichrist. But the content of the course I teach at Grove is 19th century literature that deals with religion. So we look at Schleiermacher, we look at Marx. We're just about to start looking at Nietzsche. We're meant to begin Nietzsche today, in fact, but we will. I've got the students coming over to my house for dinner on Saturday night, and we will begin our discussions of Nietzsche then. And I remember, as I was reading this afternoon, I reread the famous passage of the madman from Nietzsche's Gay Science. Nothing to do with homosexuality, of course. The German is the joyful science. The madman is this figure who rushes into a town square one day, declaring that God is dead and the people hanging around there have killed him. The people hanging around are actually atheists. He doesn't go to the church until much later in the day. The point Nietzsche is trying to make, or one of the points he's trying to make in that passage, is Enlightenment rationalism has really killed God. It's just that the Enlightenment rationalists don't know it yet. And they laugh at him and they mock him. And at some point he drops his lantern on the ground and it breaks. And he mutters to himself, I have come too early. Thunder takes time. It takes time for the light to travel from the stars. And I was struck listening to those headlines from 1923 that in many ways, you read a book by Machen, for example, intellectuals are already spotting what's going on. 100 years later, what was really the preserve of educated intellectuals has become the currency of the population. There's a sense in which the culture we live with now, the foundations for it were laid many, many years ago. And the first thing then I want to say is that means there is no immediate silver bullet. When things take a long time to fall into place, they take a long time to dismantle as well. That, you might say, is a very depressing thing. But I want to start by saying, actually, no, that's actually a very liberating thing. I think it was 2 years ago when one evening I was sitting and reading the newspaper and I turned to my wife and I said, I've become convinced that I'm going to lose every single cultural battle I put my mind to. I'm in my mid-50s. Maybe I got another 20 years of active life, maybe 30 years of life left. I said, I'm going to lose every single battle. And she said, that's depressing, isn't it? And I actually said, no, it's actually strangely liberating. Because what it means is this. I merely have to be faithful with what I've been given. I don't have to feel crushed and broken when I don't see the immediate results. So all of that is background to saying what I want to talk about today are things that have been going on for a long, long time. And I don't want you to be discouraged by my analysis. I want you to be sobered by it. But I also want you to realize that the task that falls on our shoulders is not an impossible one. It is to be faithful. Now, we can think in very constructive ways about how to be faithful. I don't want to just throw that out there as a sort of meaningless piety. I want to be very specific tomorrow about the resources we have and how we can be faithful with them. But I don't want you to be discouraged by the thought that you may not see the great changes in your lifetime. That is not our task. Our task is to be faithful. So let's think then a little bit about what I would call the pathologies. And by that, I don't mean, I'm not necessarily implying illnesses, I'm just meaning sort of aspects or characteristics of this present age. Well, I think above all, we have a new notion of what it means to be a human being that grips the imagination, particularly of America and probably of the West as a whole. It is a view of the individual where feelings reign supreme. That what you feel has become the most important thing about you. That changes everything. I won't go into everything that it changes in these talks, but it really does change how we think about everything. It changes how we think about institutions, for example. I was watching a debate in the last 12 to 18 months on whether trans people can serve in the military. And I was very struck by a statement that one of the pro-trans people made in this debate. They made the comment, why can't we allow trans people to express themselves through military service? That is a patently ridiculous comment. Military service has never been about expressing yourself. I have never been in the military. There are probably those of you in this room who have been in the military, and I would guess if you've ever been in an arena of conflict on the field of battle, you would not want to be with a bunch of people expressing themselves. You would want to be with a group of people who have lost their individuality and operate as a unit. That's what military service is about. And yet that statement can be made and sound believable today. Why? Because a notion of what it means to be a human being has so come to grip our imaginations that our understanding of institutions is being fundamentally transformed. To use the language of Yuval Levine, the political scientist, institutions have ceased to be places of formation and have become platforms of performance. That's very important. So we have individualism and expressivism rising to the fore. Emphasis on individual freedom. And yet at the same time, we have this strange emergence of new powerful identities. Yes, we want freedom, but we still want to belong. And as the old ways of belonging crumble or come under huge pressure from this new notion of what it means to be a human being, it was only a matter of time before new ways of belonging, powerful ways of belonging emerged. I've been very struck over the last 23 years living in the United States. And I emigrated, I think it was on I say August the 15th. My wife says August the 20th. I'm not sure which it is. 2001. About 3 weeks before 9/11. Very struck that in the first few years that we lived in America, the word un-American constantly featured in the news. Politicians of all sides use the language of un-American. It's a weird word for an Englishman to hear because we have no analogous word in English. I would never say something is un-English. It doesn't mean anything. That word has disappeared from common parlance, it seems to me. And one possible reason for that is that the whole notion of what it means to be an American is much more highly contested now than it was 23 years ago. Many of you have probably heard of the 1619 Project. I am an American citizen now, but the passport's one thing, the heart's another. I don't have a whole lot invested in the story of America's origins. Very grateful to America, but I don't have a lot invested in the story of American origins. What interests me about the 1619 Project is this: the fact that it exists at all. When a nation starts seriously debating the stories of origin that give it its identity and authority, something very serious is going on in the culture. So we have these new identities emerging, even as the old identities start falling away. Technology has delivered an immense feeling of power to us. More than ever before, we feel that we are masters or could be masters of our own destiny. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is only possible in a highly technologized world. And one of the things I miss in my books, by the way, is I miss really the fact that transgenderism is a species of transhumanism. The political ramifications of transgenderism are almost an accident of political convenience. It's really a species of transhumanism. At least in its ideological form. I do not wish to belittle the suffering of anybody for whom that is their individual personal struggle. But as a philosophy, it connects to transhumanism. And yet at the same time, as this technology has delivered these tremendous feeling of power into our hands, it has created incredible feelings of impotence and bondage as well. In a small way, I experienced this the other day. I saved a file, closed it down, went to look for it, couldn't find it. My computer was not syncing with the mainframe or whatever they call it these days. I was the last person in my school to do Latin and the last person not to do computer science. So I am the last man of the old age. I have little... In fact, I'm at a point now in my career, it's great. Just having to learn this new software package. And I take the view that it takes about 3 years to fire somebody in academia. So by the time the next software package comes along to solve the problems that this software package will no doubt create, I will be able to not bother learning it, and they won't be able to fire me before my retirement age. I'm almost there. But think about the feelings of impotence that technology generates, the frustrations that technology generates. On the one hand, it's meant to deliver power. On another hand, it makes us more like cogs in the machine than we have ever been before. We are more subject to power beyond our control now than in the whole of human history, in some ways. And at the heart, or I think of what's driving a lot of the disorientation that these various things presenting us with is this. The key question faced in the modern world is this. What does it mean to be human? There's a lot of hoo-ha about the question, what does it mean to be a woman? I think that confusion is generated by a deeper confusion. What does it mean to be a human? The breakdown of old institutions. The authorizing of feelings in a way that they have never been authorized before. The power of technology. All of these things make anthropology, the question of what it means to be a human being, the key issue of our day. That, incidentally, I think, was the key issue that the early critical theorists of the Frankfurt School were wrestling with. I think it's the thing that C.S. Lewis is wrestling with in The Abolition of Man. And if they wrestled with it 70 or 100 years ago, how much more do we wrestle with it today? So that's the background. And I'm going to return to that in my second lecture and say, okay, what does it mean to be a human? How can the church address that issue? The question I want to look at tonight is this. To what extent has Protestantism been complicit in creating all this? Why do I ask that question? I ask it because Catholics are asking it all the time, intellectual Catholics. And, well, when I was a pastor, I would say that probably half to two-thirds of my congregation at one particular point in time were converted Catholics, Catholics who'd converted to Protestantism. But they were by and large what I would say blue-collar people who just wanted to go to a church where the Bible was believed and preached. Among my intellectual friends, the tide flows the other way. Now, it's a much smaller tide, I think, but it fascinates me, particularly talking to young students, how many of them are attracted to Catholicism. One reason, I think, is the liturgy. Traditional Catholic liturgy is an adult liturgy. They're looking for something grown up and challenging. But another reason, I think, is this. Catholicism has quite effectively woven a story that connects a lot of modern ills to Protestantism. And so I want to look at that this evening. Catholic critique is perhaps most associated in my mind with three particular figures. Alistair MacIntyre, the former Marxist, then great Catholic ethical philosopher, still I think teaches an occasional course at the University of Notre Dame. Charles Taylor, one of my own intellectual heroes as it happens, the great Canadian philosopher, and Brad Gregory, professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. I don't want to go into the details of all of their arguments, but for example, Alistair MacIntyre, all of them riff on a similar theme, that the watershed moment in Western thinking was not the Enlightenment. It was not Immanuel Kant. The watershed moment is really the late medieval era, which gives birth to the Reformation. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that they see is, and the reason I address this now, hopefully will become clear tomorrow. One of the reasons is the late medieval era becomes increasingly squeamish about talking about essences. Now, what do I mean by that? There's a lot one could say there, but essentially this. The idea was, for Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval theologian, to be a human being was to have a moral shape about which one could then predicate certain things. To be a human meant you had to behave in certain ways. You had a certain end. Late medieval theologians, though, move away a little from seeing the connection between being a human and human ends and making it a bit more contingent. It becomes a little more grounded in the immediate will of God rather than what you are as a human being. Well, what does that do? Well, in the long run, that fuels kind of individualism. In the long run, it kind of disenchants the world. The world is less directly a reflection of God's being, less reliably an account or an expression of who God is, and a much scarier place. Think of the psalmist. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Compare that with Blaise Pascal, 17th century Christian thinker. When I survey the infinite spaces of which I know nothing and which know nothing of me, when I contemplate the eternal silence of the infinite spheres, I am alone and I am afraid. That's a Christian saying that. The world becomes, we might say, more shapeless in the late medieval period, and that plays over, so the argument goes, into the Reformation. And one of the things I want to do tomorrow is say this, one of the big problems, or two of the big problems that we have today is we don't think of human beings as having limits, and we don't think of human beings as having ends. And you can trace a sort of genealogy of that from the late Middle Ages. And I want to say tomorrow that one of the great burdens of the church is we have to go about reinstating limits and ends. But that is not as simple as simply teaching the shorter catechism. What is man's chief end? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. It has to be something that embraces the whole of the Christian imagination. Secondly, as we think about the rise of the modern person, the tilt of technology. I think a lot of Protestants can be, I've used the word squeamish already, I'll use it again, a little bit squeamish about seeing the Reformation as being a sort of product of technology. Clearly it is. If there was no printing press, there simply could not have been a Reformation in the way that we know it. The printing press is necessary for the diffusion of views in a stable form over a large area of space. The printing press fuels rising literacy rates. And there is much evidence to show that when a society's literacy rates rise, people's comfort with the status quo decreases. In other words, they become more politically aware and politically radical. And there is no doubt that Protestantism is a child of the technology of the printing press. Now, in saying that, I don't want to relativize Protestantism and say that it isn't true, but I want to say that historically, you cannot separate the two. How you construct that is up to you. The printing press arises providentially, triggers the Reformation. That's a perfectly acceptable way of articulating the relationship. But the relationship does exist. And it is incredibly disruptive. Not only disruptive for what it teaches people, but disruptive for the way it shapes human behavior and perceptions of time. For the way it makes human beings think that the world is more like stuff and they have more control over it. How does it do that? Well, many of you, no doubt familiar with the beginnings of the Reformation in Wittenberg. Nailing of the 95 Theses, the castle door in Wittenberg, October 31st, 1517. There are some Jesuit scholars who don't think it happened, but for the sake of argument, we'll accept that it happened this evening. What's interesting is how medieval that act is. Luther's concerned about a medieval practice, the sale of indulgences, connecting to a medieval doctrine, purgatory. He's not opposed to it. He wants clarity on what it means. It's actually a fascinating sermon preached by Luther. I don't think it's available in translation. It's my friend Tim Wengert brought it to my attention. I think preached in Easter 1517, where Luther is preaching on indulgences, on relics. And he's pressing this as a good practice. And halfway through the sermon, he realizes his arguments aren't making any sense. And he pivots to opposing these things, greatly upsetting Frederick the Wise, his boss, who has his own great collection of relics in the castle. But on Luther's mind in 1517 is this medieval practice. What does it mean? Even the Pope will be somewhat confused about it. When Luther's complaints, when a complaint about Luther arrives in Rome, first thing the Pope does is set up a committee to try to find out what exactly is the church's teaching on indulgences. He's complaining about a medieval church practice in a medieval way. He's put together a load of theses on it. By the way, if you've never read the 95 Theses, have a look at them. Unless you know a decent amount of medieval theology, most of them won't make any sense at all. Staggering that this thing sort of triggered a popular uprising. It's a medieval problem to be addressed in a medieval way, advertised in a medieval way, nailed up on the castle door. In some ways no more controversial than me sticking up a notice of a debate on a student notice board at Grove City College. And Luther himself, of course, is a friar. At a university, okay, the university was founded in 1501, but was founded really along medieval lines. It's a very medieval event. You may not be so familiar with the way the Reformation begins in Zurich in 1522. Starts a bit late, which is always a bit embarrassing to the Swiss, actually, particularly as the competition with Luther hots up. Begins in Zurich in 1522, during the Lenten fast. The printer, the preeminent printer of Zurich, Christoph Froschauer, gathers his men in his workshop and fries a load of sausages that he then eats with his men. Zwingli, the great reformer of Zurich, by this point sort of preacher at large for the council, he will later say he doesn't eat the sausages, but he is there, kind of putting his imprimatur on it. You might say, well, that's a kind of comical way to begin the Reformation. I would say to you it is a much more significant way to begin the Reformation than the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses accidentally triggers the Reformation. Froschauer is deliberately driving something. Think about it. The medieval calendar, the very rhythm of time, is something over which you have no control because it's connected to your agrarian lifestyle. If you and I were alive in the 14th century or the 13th century, we'd almost certainly be agrarian peasants. Our lives would be bound to the rhythm of the seasons over which we had no control whatsoever. Time was determined for us. And the liturgical calendar reflects that. There's a reason why Christmas occurs in the middle of the winter. Okay, it's building off a previous pagan festival, but there's a reason why that pagan festival was in the middle of winter. I grew up in a very rural part of England. You don't harvest crops on December the 25th. It is never done because there is no crop ready for harvesting on December the 25th in Northern Europe. Now think about frost shower. What's frost shower done? Well, frost shower's way of life is not seasonally determined. We might say he's at the beginning of what will become the Industrial Revolution. His livelihood and the livelihood of his men is determined by the machines. And the machines can run all year round. The Lenten fast is a luxury that printers cannot afford. Printing now, of course, is very easy. You just press a button. In the 16th century, it would have been a very physical job, requiring, as we would know, carbohydrates and protein. You've got to have that, and in good supply. What is frost shower doing that day? I love teaching this in class. I say, this is where the new world collides directly with the old world, and the new world wins. The new world wins. You see emerging there the seeds of a new calendar, a new rhythm of time. It's interesting that Sabbatarianism emerges most powerfully in England in the 17th century. England just happens to have the most advanced economy in Europe at that point in time. Sabbatarianism, you can get away with it in a way that the agrarian calendar is not much of a help in the city. Now, think about how that shapes your imagination. I say, well, that's very interesting. How does that shape the imagination? Think about it. The individual starts to emerge as powerful at that point. I can use technology to break time, to refashion time, to refashion the rhythm of time. The world, we might say, starts to be less stable at that point. In some ways, what we see in 1522, Karl Marx will describe in dramatic form in the Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And he talks there about all old and venerable prejudices get swept away. And all new ones are out of date almost as soon as they come into play. Think about that. Think about technology. I always buy the cheapest cell phone I can, by and large. I upgraded a little bit last time because I got a granddaughter and I want to take really nice pictures of her now. But by and large, you go for the cheap one and have an Apple. But I would say to the students, you buy your Apple phones knowing that it's already out of date by the time you buy it. The next prototype's already being developed by the time this one hits the market. Technology has made the world a place of flux. And think about how that transforms the imagination. By the time we're well on into the 16th century, the question of where can I stand to know who I am is starting to become acute as never before. It's starting to become acute as never before. This, by the way, would be one of my answers to the Catholic narrative. To blame Protestantism is silly on this level. You cannot have the 13th century when you have the printing press. You may not get Luther. You may not get Zwingli. You may not get Calvin. But you cannot have the 13th century papacy once you have the printing press. Some of you may be aware of some of the very conservative Catholics at the moment who are sort of presenting the idea that the solution to modernity's problems is to go back to having Catholic states. You cannot have a Catholic state when you have the internet. People know too much stuff. You simply can't shape their minds in the way that you once did. It's no wonder that the only people who believe this stuff are Catholic converts under the age of 40 and academics at Ivy League universities. Ordinary people know it's nonsense. They know it's nonsense. But think of how all this transforms the imagination. The individual becomes much more important. I had to teach Descartes as part of the humanities course the other week, and the way I approach Descartes is not as my philosopher colleagues would approach him. They approach him very much as part of the history of philosophy. My question is always this. We first ask, what kind of a world is it where somebody's going to start asking the question that Descartes asks? What can I be certain of? Well, it has to be a world where old certainties are crumbling and becoming uncertain. There's a reason why that question isn't really being asked in the 12th and 13th century. Not in any powerful and plausible way, because it's not a powerful and plausible question. If you're born in the 13th century, you never travel more than 40 miles from your home. You never get to choose your career. You probably don't really get to choose whom you marry. You're going to live in that village. You're not going to choose where you're christened. You're not going to choose where you get married. You're not going to choose where you have your children christened or baptized. You're not going to choose where you get buried. Everything is pretty certain. Everything is pretty certain. You don't ask questions, really, about certainty. The preoccupation, we might say, with epistemology in Western thinking really accelerates in the late 16th and on into the 17th century and onwards, because a whole heap of other sociological stuff is going down at the same time. But now think about it. Think about how Protestantism scrambles this. You're in a situation where all of the old certainties are falling away. And then suddenly, Protestantism bursts on the scene and places more responsibility for belief on your shoulders than ever before. That's pretty terrifying. You must believe at the very moment in time when all of the certainties, all of the traditional authorities around you are being dramatically attenuated. And by the way, it's not just philosophers where we see the I emerging. I'm reliably informed by a friend who's a scholar of French literature of the 16th century that Montaigne, the essayist Montaigne, is the first man in Western literature to start using the first person singular with remarkable regularity. Suddenly, Montaigne is the most interesting thing to Montaigne. He's in some ways the proto-modern man, isn't he? I have to get a little dig at Lauren Daigle in. I'm sorry if there are any Lauren Daigle fans out there. I remember listening to her song "You Say" on the radio. My wife likes Adele, and I thought it was Adele. But it wasn't, so we looked it up online. I found, "You Say," it's a gospel song. It's a gospel song all about Lauren Daigle. Staggering. Staggering. That's Montaigne without the talent after 400 or 500 years. I shouldn't be harsh. She certainly sings a whole lot better than I do. But anyway, I made that comment in a class once, and a student came furious into my office afterwards and said, "Show me one line of that song that is unbiblical." And I said, "There is not a single line in that song that is unbiblical." I said, "But there is no line in that song that is biblical either." I said, "It's a non-biblical song." That confused him, and he went away in a state of confusion. Authority is attenuated, but Protestantism places a huge responsibility on individual shoulders. Huge responsibility on individual shoulders. We also have the rise of freedom of religion. Again, this is always an interesting one to get American students to think about, because there's a sense in which freedom, a very deep sense in which freedom of religion is a good thing. I'm very glad to be living in the United States of America. America's been very good to me. And one of the things I love about America is that there is freedom of religion. The government does not tell me where to worship. The government does not tell me how to worship. The government does not tell me to worship on a Sunday. And that's a good thing. But think about, again, the impact on the imagination of that. What does that do? Tocqueville notes this in his great book, Democracy in America, because he has no analog in Europe, of course, for freedom of religion. It's one of the things that intrigues him. And he notes that it kind of tilts power towards the congregation. The church loses its power. Think about that. I was a pastor for some years. We had 3 good years. We had 3 very bad years when I had to do 3 very unpleasant discipline cases, all of which were for very serious sin, all of which tragically ended up in excommunication of the people involved. Each of the men that I excommunicated simply went down the street to worship at another church. Now, church discipline has 3 functions. It's to vindicate the name of Christ in public, to send a signal to the congregation that we take sin seriously. One of the cases was a man who'd been beating his wife for 38 years since honeymoon. And we're sending a message to women in the congregation. Your husband beats you, you can come to us, we'll take you seriously. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior in this church. The third purpose, of course, is recovery of the offender. That almost never works now, because the church has no real teeth on that front. Freedom of religion has turned Christianity into a consumer commodity. Again, Catholics might want to blame Protestants for that, but I would say no, that's just the result of the emergence of the modern world. All of this means that over time, human beings have come to be defined by their autonomy, we might say their isolation, the fact that they're individuals, have to stand on their own 2 feet, and by the choices that they have. And that's going to lie at the heart of what I'm going to get at tomorrow. I would say that those 3 things press against a stable notion of what it means to be human. And if the church is to address that, the church needs to think very strategically about how to address those issues. We have immediate things pressing in on us, LGBTQ stuff, etc., etc., etc. But we can't allow ourselves to be so transfixed by the particulars that we're not trying to put together a long-term strategy to address the general pathologies or dynamics of which these things are a result. However, I want to conclude this evening by just offering a few thoughts as I assess this. So, Catholic might say the Reformation destroyed everything. It forged the way for individualism. It forged the way for the emphasis upon the I. It created a world that was sort of plastic and malleable and subject to the human will. How would you as a Protestant respond? Well, first of all, I would say, or would repeat what I've already said. The printing press. It's not Protestantism that is the root of our problems. It is technology. Don't get me wrong there, by the way. I'm not doing a Luddite thing and saying technology's bad. Used a big chunk of technology to get here pretty quickly today. Very glad for it. And as a history professor, students will sometimes say, which period of history would you like to have been born in? And my view is, I'm quite happy being born exactly when I was, actually. Certainly antibiotics, painkillers, and flush toilets. Absolutely basic. We need those. And really, the way the world's going now, I'm quite happy to have more behind me than in front of me. So 1967, that was like the sweet spot to be born, as far as I'm concerned. The medieval synthesis is unsustainable. Protestantism connects to technological developments. We can't avoid that. The real question then has to be, okay, so what's gained and what is lost by the Reformation? And I would say this. What do we gain at the Reformation? We regain the individual existential urgency of the gospel. Matthias mentioned, conversionism and activism as part of the Bebbington Quadrilateral. And I know that conversionism is understood differently in my Presbyterian tradition compared to, say, the Baptist or the Methodist tradition. Conversionism has a range of meanings. But I think we can probably agree that whatever else it means that the Christian has to have some existential concern with the Lord Jesus Christ. There's an urgency to faith in Protestantism that I think you look long and hard to find in the Middle Ages. There's much in the Middle Ages, particularly in the doctrine of God, and Dr. Vidu, of course, has done tremendous work in helping evangelicals and Protestants recover the patristic and the medieval classical doctrine of God. I think it's very important. I do not wish to dismiss the Middle Ages at this point, but to say one of the things that is recaptured at the Reformation is existential urgency. I would also say another thing that is recaptured at the Reformation is the centrality of the preached word, helped by the printing press. It's not that there wasn't preaching in the Middle Ages. Bernard of Clairvaux. I think you say Bernard. Sounds kind of odd to an English ear. I always think that, the wrath of God sounds much more serious when an Englishman says it than an American. The wrath of God does not carry the power. Preaching. I would also add to that the recovery of congregational singing. And those latter two, preaching and congregational singing, connect directly to some of the things I want to say tomorrow. Because the answer to the question of what does it mean to be a human being is not just an argument. It's patterns of behavior and worship as well. So there are net gains. Significant parts of the New Testament, I think, are recaptured, repristinated at the Reformation. What's lost? Well, and we can perhaps talk about, I have no answers to these particularly, but I don't mean this to sound like a cop-out, but I think sometimes be aware of the problem is at least part of the solution, if it is not the solution in itself. Net losses. Church authority is the big one. I think when Catholics say the Reformation breaks church authority, there's a lot of truth to that claim. It's not the Reformation's fault, though. Sometimes it's the fault of the printing press, making religious unity something of a chimera in the modern era. And that second one is church unity. Church unity. I think Protestants we default very quickly, don't we, to the idea that unity is spiritual. We have spiritual unity. I find it hard to read Jesus' prayer that they shall all be one, or the assumptions of Paul's letters to refer simply to spiritual unity. And we do not take real church unity seriously. I'm a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I think there are at least 4 other Presbyterian denominations in the United States, or Reformed denominations, that I could tonight take the ordination vows for without blinking an eyelid. And yet my denomination persists in not voting itself out of existence at every General Assembly. That tells me that we're not really taking church unity seriously. So that is lost. And all of that then sets up my lecture for tomorrow. What do I want to do in my lecture tomorrow? I want to look at this modern notion of what it means to be a human being against the background of the problems and the strengths that Protestantism brings, and suggest that we do have resources actually to address each and every one of the challenges coming from, say, identity politics in the present day. Thank you very much for listening so patiently. Do you want to do a Q&A? I forgot to ask Matthias, is the time for Q&A or?
Sure.
I'm happy to do 10 minutes of Q&A if people want to ask questions. Dean. Is it Dean?
Would you please stand up? I don't know if we have a microphone that we can.
So I know that you made a comment in a previous lecture about coming out of the Reformation, where Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, and your comment was that the greatest it's really unfortunate that they disagreed on the Lord's Supper, but you said it would be a greater travesty if they hadn't disagreed. And I just want to bring up the point that you just made on Christian unity.
Yeah.
So how can you reconcile those two statements together, or do you backtrack on the previous one?
It's always good to be held to account for something you said before. I still stand by that.
10 years ago or something.
That's okay, Dean. Unusually, I stand by what I said. I think the difference would be this. Well, let me give a little bit of background. I do think Marburg 1529, for those of you not familiar with Reformation history, that's the moment when the Reformed and the Lutherans split on the Lord's Supper. And it's really driven by the personality of Luther. I think if it had not been Luther there, but had been one of the other leading lights in the emerging Lutheran church, an agreement could have been brokered. It might have been like the agreement for the Irish Free State in British history, where as soon as it gets back to the Irish, it's kiboshed by the leadership. It could have been. I do think there could have been grounds for agreement. The burden of that comment, I think, was this, though, that the Lord's Supper is important. And against the background of a lot of evangelical discussion that tends to see only a very few things as important, it's important to realize the sacraments are important. I think of John Stott's book on basic Christianity that I think, from memory, mentions the Lord's Supper once. So I think my comment there is against the background of the general sort of anti-sacramental emphasis of evangelical Protestantism, both here and back home in the UK. Having said that, I would say it is different to the speech I've just made, though, on this grounds, and that is this. The difference between the OPC and the PCA, for example, is not a difference of any great substance. What separates the OPC and the PCA is, by and large, a different way of funding missions. That was the thing that sort of torpedoed one of our union discussions in times past. Now, the funding of missions is important, but I don't think it rises to the level of disrupting visible church unity. So in some ways, I'm making both an audacious but also a very small statement when I say, wouldn't it be great if Presbyterian churches could unite? Because really, we do agree on we agree on the Lord's Supper, we agree on baptism, we agree on the incarnation, we agree on Trinity, we agree on salvation, we even agree on church government. Why do we stay apart at this point? So in some ways, I'm looking at two different things then. On the one hand, I'm saying we don't want an unprincipled homogenization of everybody that just ends up relativizing really important doctrines. On the other hand, we don't want a fragmentation that has ended up making the way we fund missions as important as the Lord's Supper. And that, I think, would be the difference.
So where is that dividing line? Like, those are two big contrasts.
Yeah.
So where is the sweet middle ground, or you're comfortable with for Presbyterian?
Yeah. Well, I think for a Presbyterian, the middle ground is the Westminster Confession. I'm less enamored of having the catechisms as part of my subscription. They were never meant to be subscription documents. Remember some years ago when the Gospel Coalition got hammered for producing its New City Catechism. A lot of conservative Presbyterians say, parachurches can't produce catechisms. Ironically, I thought the Gospel Coalition absolutely legit in doing that, because the Westminster Catechisms were really put forth as documents for, if you're not capable of writing your own catechism, we've got one for you kind of thing. So square the catechisms out where you get controversial stuff, really controversial stuff on the Lord's Day. The Westminster Confession seems to me to be decent middle ground. All Presbyterians can agree on that. All Presbyterians do agree on that already. So why do we have separate polities? Now, if we move beyond that, saying, okay, we now have the one Presbyterian church of the world. When we move to talking with the Lutherans on the one side or the Baptists on the other, then we're going to get into trickier waters. But I'm a pragmatic Englishman, a nation of shopkeepers, as Napoleon said. I just want to deal with the thing that's in front of my face at this moment in time. I can't begin to think about what ecumenism with the Lutherans would look like until we've actually cracked ecumenism among those who already agree on everything. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I do have a wireless microphone.
Oh, there's a mic coming.
You attribute many changes in society at large and the church to the printing press. Do you want to make any predictions about the internet's impact and AI's impact on the church?
Yeah.
What would we be saying in 100 years, 300 years about the impact those technologies have on our communities?
Very good question. First of all, I would say one of the problems with that question now is that technology moves so fast. When you think the printing press was invented middle of the 15th century, Reformation begins in the 16th century, and then you have major wars in Europe taking you through to the middle of the 17th century, all ultimately triggered by things triggered by the printing press. One, technological innovation. We're living in an era now where technological innovations are effectively accelerating social change, so that the difference between 1200 and 1400 in my home village in Gloucestershire, 200 whole years, would be less than the difference between 2001 and 2024 in the United States. So in terms of long-term predictions, who knows? I don't know what crazy thing is going to be invented next. But I do think we see even now unfortunate impact of technology. COVID. I want to avoid getting into any controversies about masks, et cetera, with COVID. What interested me about COVID was this. In the early days, a lot of churches, including my own, went online. And there's a sense in which that was kind of a good thing, on the grounds that you don't know if it's the Black Plague and you don't want 40% of your people dying in the next year or two from it. So it was a sort of a good precaution. What disturbed me about that move, though, was not the move itself, but the fact that so few people thought anything had been lost. That disturbed me. Okay, so now we think that if you can see the pastor on a computer screen from the comfort of your front room on a Sunday, that's worship. That's worship. That's an example of how technology, combining with a certain predilection of Protestantism for the preached word, which is an important emphasis, has actually disemboweled worship, I think. I sat on a panel at Grove City College. One of the other panelists was an Eastern Orthodox priest. And that question, somebody asked, what do you think about online worship? And he snatched the microphone before I get hold of it, and he said, virtual worship is not worship. And then he handed the microphone on. But I think that's a good example that our imaginations have been changed to thinking that real human contact can now be quite adequately mediated through technology, and that being there. And I try to make the students think about this in class. I say, if a student says to me, I worship online on a Sunday, I'll say to them, well, imagine yourself on your deathbed. Do you want your friends, your wife, your pastor sitting by your bedside or Skyping in, or maybe even watching a pre-recorded message? What do you want? And even at age 18, 19, 20, when they all think, particularly the guys, think they're going to live forever anyway, so it's only a hypothetical question, they all say, actually, in those circumstances, I'd want my pastor there. And that allows me then to say, so actually bodily presence is important. Bodily proximity is important. Sometimes they're carrying on these long-distance romances, and I'll say, is seeing your girlfriend on the video screen as good as actually sitting on the couch with her watching a movie? And they'll say no. And then I'll say, do you sometimes do this really weird thing? I've never done it. But where they will synchronize watching a movie with their loved one who's like hundreds of miles away. And I say, well, why do you do that? You do that because you're trying to replicate bodily presence. So, it's not so much a prediction here as to say we're already seeing it happening in other unfortunate ways, that I think the attenuation of human embodiment is significant. And I think that has significance for things like transgenderism as well, actually. That would be a different argument. But the downplaying of the human body, which is something I want to get at tomorrow in my talk, is one of the ways that technology is really playing out. Great question.
Dr. Trueman, Calvin starts his institutes with the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man. And in another lecture, at another place, the classical theology, you mentioned that you're finding that maybe Protestants are losing touch with the doctrine of God, and that you're finding more in common with Catholics and the doctrine of God than Protestants. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's kind of off topic for this evening, but I think one of the things that's emerged in the last 10 to 20 years, partly due to changes in historical scholarship in my own area of 16th and 17th century studies, which is, my postdoctoral work was involved to some significant degree in remapping the way the relationship between 17th century Protestantism and late medieval theology. There's been a revolution in historiography on the relationship between the late Middle Ages and the Reformation and immediate post-Reformation. At the same time as there's also been something of a revolution in early church studies, looking at the doctrine of God in the early church. When I was an undergraduate, the idea was there was this big divide between East and West, and the East emphasized the threeness of God, and the West emphasized the unity of God. That has been shown to be the result of reading back later doctrinal concerns and debates into the early church. So there's been a major historiographical change over the last 20, 25 years. The knock-on effect of that has been that it has become clear that a number of leading evangelical theologians, in their articulation of the doctrine of God, have not actually articulated the doctrine of God as it was understood by, for example, the fathers at Nicaea and at the Council of Constantinople, or at the Westminster Assembly. Now, it seems to me you can do one of two things in that situation. You can turn around and say, well, Nicaea got it wrong and the Westminster Assembly got it wrong, and we've got it right. Or you can say, we've got it wrong, and we need to bring our thinking into line with the early church and the Westminster Assembly. What you cannot do, I think, is say, we've got it right, and we're going to reinterpret the Westminster Confession and the early church in the light of our insights, which seems to have been the path that some have gone down. I think it's a bit unfortunate. A lot of it, I think, comes from the fact, there are a whole variety of reasons why evangelicalism may have lost its power away on this topic. But one of the reasons, I think, is a right emphasis upon the authority of the Bible. But that has tended to default into a kind of rather odd, non-metaphysical, literal reading of the Bible at certain points that is kind of problematic. So in saying what I've said, I do not wish to cast aspersions on any of the theologians that I think have erred on this point, but I do think that we are at a stage now where we are better equipped to understand what the church, prior to the Enlightenment, thought about these things. That's really Dr. Vidu's territory. He would give a more competent answer.
Dr. Trueman, I'm right here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I heard you up there.
That was so funny. Dr. Trueman, so it's amazing that we have these opportunities in academia and spaces like this. and I would say particularly not just academia, Christian leaders within the church to discuss these issues, right? Because, I mean, you've made it clear it's a massive, pervasive issue in our country and the world, especially in the West, right? And so some people may question, what's the point of doing it in engaging culture? Because it's great that we're doing this so that we can go to our communities and preach the gospel rightly, a right framework that's biblical while addressing the issues of this world, right? And build up the body of Christ. But so I have two questions, like 1A, 1B connected. Do you think there's a point, because there's some people who don't think there's a point in engaging culture, because they're like, for example, what's the point of having a conversation with someone that's atheist when you're, a Christian, they're not going to believe you, which I believe there is a point, but that's a whole other thing, right? And so that same thing with engaging the culture. What's the point if they're not going to want to believe it, especially when things are predicated on our feelings? So my question is, do you think there's a point in also engaging culture with this content? And by culture, I mean people who are Christians, as well as people who aren't. Right. And there's a middle, right? People who are Christians, but who are open, and people who are on the extreme aren't. And if so, if you believe there's a point to it, what would you have to say to those who believe God's called them to engage culture with this issue? Yeah, good, very good questions. First of all, I certainly think we're not called to leave this world. So the obvious answer to the first part of, should we be engaging unbelievers is yes, we're commanded to do so. We're commanded to give a reason for the hope that is within us. Not everybody has the gift of walking into a bar and just talking to a stranger about Jesus. I don't have that gift. But if somebody engages me and asks me, what is the reason for the hope within you, I'm obliged to tell them. And I think in that context, it's useful to know how people think in order to know what is, humanly speaking, going to be a persuasive strategy. So, for example, the humanities course at Grove City that I teach is the capstone humanity course. I would say 60-70% of the kids in the class are Christians. 30% of them are football players. They're at Grove to play football. How do I engage the 30% of the guys who are football? I like them. I hate American football. I'm a rugby man, but I pretend to like it in class, and I try to engage them a bit. How do I get them interested? And I wrestled with this for a couple of years, and one of the ways I found was that using the categories of freedom and belonging. I started the first class, I was saying, okay, basic human needs, whether you're a Christian or non-Christian in this class, I bet there are two things that are important to you. One, you like being free. These are kids who came up through lockdown. Who liked lockdown? Nobody. You like being free. But on the other hand, you also want to have friends. You want to belong to people, because a lot of your sense of self-worth comes from other people engaging you and treating you with respect. You're belonging to a group. Well, let's look then at how Christianity answers that dilemma, because it is a dilemma. To be free is not to belong. To belong is to sacrifice some freedom. Let's see how Christianity deals with that dilemma. And let's look at how a whole host of other modern philosophies have dealt with that dilemma. So we come to Nietzsche, and eventually, I say, Nietzsche, 10 out of 10 for freedom, 0 out of 10 for belonging. Marx, 10 out of 10 for belonging, 0 out of 10 for freedom. And I set it up like that. So I think knowing this stuff helps an apologetic strategy. Secondly, I think knowing this sort of stuff helps Christians. I will use this example again tomorrow, but as you've asked the question, I will use it tonight. I get a lot of young Christian people asking me at Grove, give me an argument against homosexuality. Easy to point them to the Bible. And they're young Christian people, so you point them to the Bible on this issue, they believe what the Bible says. But they're of a generation unlike my generation, where they got a lot of gay friends. Nice, good gay friends. And I know that at the back of their mind there's another question rattling around, and that question is, why does the Bible say that? Is it just that God is like a tyrant who wants to ruin the life of my gay friends? He wants to make them miserable. And to help them with that question, you've got to give them a broader anthropology. You've got to show them the Bible teaches this, and guess what? It actually makes sense that the Bible teaches this to protect themselves. So one simple statistic that I would point students to on a government web page. It's hidden away, but you can find it.
active male homosexuals are 17 times more likely to develop anal cancer than any other member of the community, which allows you to talk about a particular form of male sexual activity and say, do you think maybe that the Bible not thinking that's a good idea is just God randomly deciding to ban that behavior? Or does it connect to the structure of the human body in some ways? That using the body in this way rather than that way, does it damage? So I think this sort of stuff is helpful, I would say, in a sort of catechetical way in the church. Now, advice for those who, want to engage the culture, I would say, well, first of all, that's most Christians, because most Christians actually have mortgages, student loans, don't work for the church. They are engaging the culture as human beings every day. I would say be well read. Think these things through. The quotation from Barth earlier, have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. That's not a bad piece of advice. It's not everybody's forte. And we all live and work in different environments. The requirements of my environment, teaching in a Christian liberal arts college, I'm very privileged on that front. I can enjoy my work without a lot of aggravation. My boys both work in private industry. My eldest son probably lost his job because he was my son. Some very strange stuff went on at his workplace. It's a very different world for them, but they need to be informed about what's going on so they can be, if nothing else, as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents.
Hi, thank you. You're probably going to get to this tomorrow, but when you spoke about individualism, it sounded, to my ear, negative, which could be just conditioning in me. And the example of feelings, having individual feelings, with the military example, you need to get rid of the individualism and become a unit. I'm wondering if tomorrow or tonight, if you want to discuss the value that God places on individualism and what would be a way of thinking about God's view of individualism in our interactions with people.
Again, excellent question. Certainly, I probably didn't make this as clear as I should have done, but in the latter part of my lecture when I talked about, what is one of the gains from the Reformation? Existential urgency, personal responsibility. That's comes down on the shoulder of the individual. And I think that captures something of the New Testament. And certainly in the New Testament, we're also taught that God cares for us as individuals, numbers the hairs of our heads. I once said that in class, and a student said to me, "Do you used to have hair, Dr. Trueman?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Does that mean that God knows less about you now than he once did?" That's a profound theological question to which I did not have an immediate answer. So certainly the individual is important. I think the problem is not so much the individual. It's not that the individual is invented in the 16th, 17th century, that people before that time had no self-consciousness. I think the problem is this. The problem is the authority we grant to the feelings of the individual. Now, I'll give a study in... I'll give you an example here from the Bible. If we'd say, does the Bible give voice to individual inner space and emotional feelings? Of course. And the obvious place to go for that is the Psalms. Not all of the Psalms, but many of the Psalms explore the inner space. And one of the great things I found about the Psalms, during tough times, has been, I don't think I can go as far as Calvin and say sort of every human emotion is there, but all of the important ones are there. And just as an aside, I remember, I think Psalm 128 verse 6, "May you live to see your children's children," which I always thought meant, "May you live a long time," until I held my granddaughter in my arms. And then I realized, no, that's a particular kind of blessing, a particular kind of joy. It's nothing to do with how long you've lived. It's what you've seen. Psalm 73, though, or Psalm 88, those are psalms that really get into the nitty-gritty of the inner feelings. Psalm 73 still speaks just because, who has not been frustrated that the wicked sometimes literally get away with murder and yet seem to be honored by society and live long and happy lives. And we all know young people who've been wonderful and have been just cut down before they've even reached the summer of their lives. And who doesn't feel that as a problem? Who doesn't struggle with that? Well, you get that in Psalm 73. Or Psalm 88, the abject loneliness of the psalmist there, which it ends, you're my friends you have put far from me. But what's interesting about both of those psalms is this. Those inner feelings are set within the context of a larger reality. Psalm 88, you have to look hard for it, but Psalm 88 begins with the psalmist calling on the covenant name of God. So the rest of the psalm may be bleak and despairing, but at the very beginning he reminds himself that God is a God who has a covenantally shaped history with Israel, of which he is a part. And Psalm 73 is very explicit. It says, when I took it in my heart to ponder these things, my feet had nearly slipped until I went to the sanctuary. And then their way was made clear to me. And when I think of that psalm, I think what's wonderful about that psalm is, in some ways it's a modern psalm, because I could look at that with kids in church, I could look at it with kids in class, and they can sympathize, even empathize with the agonies of the psalmist there. And yet it doesn't terminate in just an authorizing of, okay, everything seems to be unjust, so God either doesn't exist or is unfair, because my feelings trump everything. Those feelings are ultimately brought under the authority of the external God. So I would say, think of army service. I think of a guy called Sam Will, who was an old man in the church where my wife and I met. And I think I'm right in saying that, September the 3rd, 1939, the king makes a radio announcement to the British people and declares that he's not heard back from the German ambassador and Britain is now at war with Germany. And Sam Will, from memory, I think he got married in the July or the August of 1939. And within a few months, he'd signed up and went abroad to fight for king and country and didn't see his wife for another 6 years. It just blows my mind. Now, I can't believe that it wasn't an agonizing wrench for him to do that. My wife and I are huge fans of All Creatures Great and Small. James Herriot's just gone off to fight, and they capture the pathos of that moment rather beautifully. It must have been agony for those men to leave loved ones behind to fight, but they still did it because their imagination was dominated by something bigger than their own feelings. And that's what I think we need in the church. We need not to tell people that their feelings don't count. We need their imaginations to be gripped by such a big picture of God that their feelings are relativized. I talked to the students about Paul in 2 Corinthians, that when he says, after that litany of suffering, when he says this is but a light momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that is to come, what he is not saying is that these sufferings are nothing. What he's saying is that in comparison with what is to come, these sufferings are nothing. And that's a very different thing, because that really does then allow you to speak to the student who's just heard their beloved grandfathers died and say to them, this is a dark moment for you. And nothing can sort of take the immediate sting away. But remember, Granddad loved Jesus. You will see him again. And this real pain that you feel now will be as nothing compared to the joy you will experience when you and he are reunited in front of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, great question. Don't want to say individual feelings aren't important, but do want to say they're not the ultimate authority.